winter of 1874, federal investigators discovered something in the West Virginia mountains that required presidential authorization to seal, not just classify, seal. The kind of discovery that makes grown men resign from government service rather than carry its weight. Between 1847 and 1874, 99 people vanished from Hollow Ridge, a settlement so remote it existed on no official maps. But this wasn't random tragedy. This was methodical, precise. Every disappearance occurred on the night of the new moon, exactly every 3 months, each victim leaving behind a single left shoe filled with mountain clay that was still warm to the touch. Warm, as if it had been pulled from deep underground moments before dawn. When investigators finally reached the settlement, they found 312 residents living in impossible wealth. Children dressed in Boston finery, tables laden with imported luxuries, and every single person, from the youngest child to the eldest patriarch, responded to questions with identical words, spoken in identical cadence. The mountain keeps its own accounts. What they discovered beneath Hollow Ridge in that abandoned copper mine changed 3 investigators so profoundly that 2 never spoke again, and the third spent his remaining years in an asylum, drawing the same symbol on his cell wall until his fingers bled. You're about to learn what they found, and once you know, you'll understand why some knowledge was never meant to surface. The men who founded Hollow Ridge in 1845 weren't outcasts or criminals. They were skilled miners, craftsmen, engineers, people who had built honest lives until the economic collapse destroyed everything they'd worked for. 43 families following a charismatic mine foreman named Josiah Henley into mountains that local Cherokee tribes had marked as forbidden for generations. These weren't desperate people making desperate choices. These were intelligent men who believed they could outsmart forces that had been claiming lives for centuries. Henley had spent 20 years underground, and he claimed he could smell copper in rock from a mile away. But what drew him to that specific valley wasn't his mining expertise. It was a conversation with an old Cherokee guide named Joseph Stonecrow in a Wheeling tavern. Stonecrow, deep in his cups, had told him of a place where the water ran red after rain, and where the earth itself seemed to breathe. The Cherokee called it the place where the earth bleeds, and their oral histories recorded that even ancient peoples had marked it as forbidden. But Henley saw opportunity where others saw warning. His preliminary surveys indicated massive copper deposits of unprecedented purity, copper that had formed under geological conditions that shouldn't exist in the Appalachian range. He kept his findings secret, sharing them only with trusted associates, knowing that if word spread, larger interests would sweep in and claim everything. The families who followed him carried skills carefully selected during months of secret meetings. They had everything needed for a successful mining operation, everything except understanding of what they were truly agreeing to mine. The journey to Hollow Ridge took 3 weeks through terrain so treacherous that 2 wagons were lost to ravines, and 1 family turned back after their youngest child nearly drowned. Those who persevered found themselves in a valley that seemed to exist in its own world, cut off from America by walls of stone and forests so thick that noon looked like twilight beneath the canopy. Sunlight reached the valley floor for only 4 hours each day, even in summer. The surrounding peaks rose like prison walls, trapping clouds that would pour into the valley like milk into a bowl, shrouding the settlement and mist for days at a time. But what they built there defied the isolation. Within 18 months, Hollow Ridge had grown to nearly 200 souls, with infrastructure that shouldn't have been possible for such a remote location. They built a sawmill powered by Burden Creek, which ran red with mineral deposits every spring, staining the mill wheel a permanent rust color that looked like dried blood in certain light. They established a general store with meticulous records, a schoolhouse where 32 children learned from books donated by a mysterious Baltimore benefactor who insisted on anonymity, and a Methodist church whose steeple was the only structure tall enough to catch morning light before it reached the valley floor. The settlement even had its own postal route, though the mail carrier, a Cherokee Welshman named Daniel Moss, would later testify that he always felt watched in Hollow Ridge. The residents would gather in groups and whisper when he arrived, and no one ever sent personal letters, only business correspondence related to their copper trade. But most disturbing was what visitors noticed about the mining operation itself. Hollow Ridge produced refined copper ingots of remarkable purity, 99.9% pure according to Baltimore assayers, yet no one ever saw the smelting operation. Work shifts began at midnight and ended before dawn, with miners entering and leaving through a concealed entrance that visitors were prevented from approaching. The copper they produced had properties that made it highly sought after by industries that understood its true value. Telegraph companies paid premium prices for Hollow Ridge copper wire, claiming it conducted electricity with less resistance than any other source. Jewelers in Philadelphia and New York reported that items made from their copper never tarnished, maintaining a peculiar warmth to the touch that customers found appealing but couldn't explain. One Harvard scientist, Dr. Edmund Whitlock, traveled to Hollow Ridge in 1847 to study the copper, but his notes from the visit were found with crucial pages missing, and he refused to discuss his findings, retiring from academia shortly after his return. What made this copper different wasn't just its purity, it was its behavior. When tested privately by Friedrich Dietrich, a German immigrant who had studied chemistry at the University of Heidelberg, the metal displayed properties that defied known science. It maintained a constant temperature of exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of ambient conditions. Even when placed in ice or held over flame, it remained at human body temperature. When melted and recast, it produced ingots of impossible density. A cubic inch weighed 3 times what it should, according to copper's known properties. Most disturbing was what happened when the copper was placed in water. The liquid would begin moving in patterns that resembled breathing or circulation, pulsing rhythmically 20 times per minute, creating tiny whirlpools that spun in alternating directions. If multiple pieces were placed in the same container, they would synchronize their effects, the water moving in complex patterns that suggested communication between the metal fragments. Dietrich wrote in his hidden notes that watching these patterns for too long induced severe headaches and nightmares of being underground, unable to breathe yet unable to die. The prosperity this brought to Hollow Ridge was undeniable and immediate, but it came with a price that the residents were only beginning to understand. The first disappearance occurred on March 15, 1847, exactly 18 months after the settlement's founding, on the night of a new moon that also marked the spring equinox. Margaret Dietrich, 19 years old and engaged to marry William Cranston's eldest son, vanished from her family's cabin sometime between sunset and sunrise. Her parents woke to find her bed empty, though the sheets remained perfectly arranged as if she had never slept in them. The window stood open despite freezing temperatures, ice having formed on the inside of the glass. Centered precisely on her pillow was a single leather shoe, her left one, placed with deliberate care and filled with damp clay and pine needles that smelled of deep earth and something else, something metallic and organic that no one could identify. The shoe itself was disturbing in its condition. While it was certainly Margaret's, her initials tooled into the leather, it showed wear patterns that didn't match its age. The sole was worn through in places, as if she had walked hundreds of miles, yet she had owned the shoes for only 2 months. The leather was stained with mineral deposits that had crystallized in patterns resembling veins or root systems. When her mother tried to empty the clay from the shoe, she found it had hardened into a perfect mold of Margaret's foot, accurate down to the smallest detail. The community searched for 3 days with thoroughness that reflected both their desperation and growing fear. They divided the forest into grids, combed every inch within 5 miles, checked every mine shaft and cave, dragged Burden Creek from source to where it joined the larger Shadow River. Henley himself led search parties up treacherous mountain paths where snow still lay 3 feet deep. But what they found disturbed them more than her absence. Near an old Cherokee marker stone covered in symbols that predated even the Cherokee, they discovered 17 dead ravens arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies still warm despite freezing temperatures, each having died at exactly the same moment with identical neck injuries and wing positions. At the center of that circle of dead ravens was a handprint pressed into the frozen earth, a handprint that matched Margaret's exactly, though it was pressed deeper into the ground than any human hand should have been able to achieve. Fresh axe marks on surrounding trees formed a path leading directly to the sealed entrance of what locals called the Old Working, a mineshaft that predated even Cherokee occupation. The axe marks themselves defied explanation, cut at varying heights, starting from ground level and rising to nearly 20 feet up an ancient oak's trunk, as if whoever made them had been ascending into the air as they walked. The marks were cut at angles that hurt to look at directly, forming patterns that seemed meaningful but remained just beyond comprehension. When they brought dogs from a neighboring settlement to track Margaret's scent, the animals refused to work, whining and cowering when presented with her belongings. The second disappearance came exactly 3 months later on June the 15th, the summer solstice. William Macready, aged 34 and strong enough to carry 200 pounds of ore on his back for miles, vanished from the mine's entrance station where he'd been keeping watch. His replacement found the guard post empty at midnight, a single shoe placed on the stool where William should have been sitting, filled with the same mixture of clay and pine needles, still warm to the touch. William's rifle remained propped against the wall, unfired, his tobacco pipe sitting on the small table still smoking as if he had just set it down. The locked door to the mine entrance stood open, though the key remained in William's shoe along with the clay. Inside the entrance tunnel, investigators found footprints in the dust, but they started 30 feet inside the tunnel, as if William had materialized there rather than walking in. The prints proceeded deeper into the mine for about 100 feet, before stopping abruptly at a solid wall of rock, as if he had walked directly into stone and disappeared. By September, when 8-year-old Timothy Cranston became the third to vanish, panic gripped Hollow Ridge with the grip of men who finally understood they were trapped. The boy disappeared from a group of children playing in afternoon sunlight. The other children reported that he had been there one moment and gone the next, like a candle being snuffed out. They found his shoe in the exact center of the Methodist church, though the building had been locked and Reverend Sutterfield held the only key. The clay in this shoe contained something new, tiny fragments of what appeared to be crystallized blood, though no one could explain how blood could crystallize in such a manner. Families barricaded doors with lumber torn from the mill. Men patrolled with rifles loaded with bullets they'd blessed in the church. Women clutched their children close, tying them to their wrists with rope when they had to leave the house. Some families attempted to leave the valley, but found excuses to stay. Sick children, broken wagon wheels, sudden storms that made travel impossible. It was as if the valley itself conspired to keep them there, as if they had become part of something larger that wouldn't allow them to simply walk away. The disappearances followed a pattern so precise it couldn't be coincidental. Always the night of the new moon, always exactly 3 months apart. Always leaving behind that single left shoe filled with warm clay. Always taking people who were essential to the community's function. The engaged daughter of the chemist, the strong miner who guarded the entrance, the innocent child who represented their future. Someone or something was selecting them with intelligence and purpose, following rules that had been established long before Hollow Ridge existed. It was then that Josiah Henley called a town meeting that would change everything, a meeting where he would finally reveal what he had found in the deepest chambers of the old working and what bargain he had made to bring them the prosperity they'd enjoyed. The entire population of Hollow Ridge gathered in the Methodist church on a night when fog was so thick that people could barely see 3 feet ahead. They came in groups, holding hands to avoid getting lost, their lantern creating ghostly halos in the mist. Standing before every remaining soul in the settlement, Henley spoke words that multiple witnesses would later recount with chilling consistency, each remembering not just what he said, but the exact cadence of his voice, as if the words had been burned into their memories. We came here seeking fortune, and fortune demands sacrifice. The mountain gives us copper. Copper gives us wealth, and wealth demands payment. We all understood this when we signed the compact. We all agreed to the terms. The lottery is fair, the selection is random, and the obligation is absolute. He paused, his eyes reflecting the lamplight in a way that made them seem to glow. We are not the first to make this bargain, and we will not be the last. The mountain has been feeding for longer than human memory, and it will continue to feed long after we are gone. But for now, for our time, we are its servants, and it is our provider. That's when Martha Sutterfield, the Reverend's wife, stood and asked the question that would haunt survivor testimony for decades. What did you find in the old working, Josiah? What did you wake up? Henley's response was to produce a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, written in a language that predated any known indigenous script. But somehow, impossibly, everyone in the church could read it, the meaning flowing directly into their minds without translation. The journal told of a previous mining operation, centuries old, maybe millennia, that had discovered the same copper deposits and made the same bargain. It contained detailed instructions for the ritual of selection, the schedule of sacrifice, and most disturbingly, a ledger showing that exactly 2,347 people had fed the mountain before this previous civilization had disappeared, leaving only the sealed mine and warning stones the Cherokee had wisely chose and to respect. The history revealed in that ancient journal stretched back beyond written records into geological time, where human history became indistinguishable from myth. Cherokee oral traditions documented decades later by ethnographer James Mooney spoke of a hole in the earth that existed before memory, before the migration of peoples, perhaps before humanity itself had developed language. The Cherokee never mined there, never hunted within 5 miles of it, and their medicine men performed annual ceremonies to keep it sealed, ceremonies that required the sacrifice of precious trade goods, and sometimes took weeks to complete. They called it the breathing place, where the earth exhaled its poisons and inhaled its sustenance. Their stories told of a time before time, when beings that were not quite human and not quite spirit had delved deep into the earth, seeking something that was never meant to be found. These beings had built structures underground that defied understanding. Chambers where up became down, tunnels that folded back on themselves, yet still led somewhere new, spaces that were larger inside than the mountain that contained them could possibly accommodate. According to Cherokee stories, these ancient miners had eventually disappeared, but not through death or departure. They had become part of what they mined, their flesh transforming into metal, their bones into ore, their blood into the red water that seeped from the mountain every spring. The Cherokee believed that on certain nights you could still hear them working in the depths, the ring of their picks against stone carrying up through miles of rock, though the sound came from directions that didn't exist in the normal world. Spanish explorers in 1561 had reported finding evidence of extensive pre-Columbian mining operations in the central Appalachians. Hernando de Soto's lieutenant, Rodrigo de Guzman, wrote in his journal of discovering perfectly round vertical shafts descending beyond the reach of their longest ropes, nearly 500 feet, with walls so smooth they seemed melted rather than carved. The shafts were precisely 3 feet in diameter, too narrow for a man to work comfortably, yet they showed clear evidence of excavation. Guzman's most disturbing discovery was a chamber accessed through one of these shafts, where he found what he described as statues of such lifelike quality that we initially took them for corpses. These figures were made entirely of copper, but with a level of detail that exceeded any known metallurgical technique of the period. They depicted humans in positions that could have been agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. Their faces turned skyward, their hands raised as if in supplication or surrender. When one of Guzman's men struck a statue with a hammer, attempting to break off a piece as evidence, the entire figure crumbled to dust, and the man fell ill immediately, dying within hours while sweating a fluid that smelled of copper. The indigenous guides refused to approach closer than 100 yards to these sites, claiming the holes belonged to the Star Walkers, beings who came before and would come after, who had descended from the sky to harvest the blood of the earth. They said these beings had not died, but had chosen to merge with what they sought, becoming eternal guardians of treasures that should never see daylight. One guide, an elderly man named Speaks with Thunder, told Guzman that his grandfather's grandfather had seen lights moving underground near these shafts, lights that moved in patterns suggesting intelligence, but followed no human logic. When Henley's expedition first arrived in 1845, they found these ancient workings partially collapsed, but still accessible. The main shaft descended 400 feet through solid rock before opening into a natural cavern system of staggering complexity. The initial descent was treacherous, the original ladder system having long since rotted away, leaving only iron brackets embedded in stone, many of which had been transformed into copper through some unknown process. But it was what they found in the deepest accessible chamber that changed everything. Walls covered in crystalline copper formations, unlike anything in geological textbooks, copper so pure it could be peeled off in sheets like paper, metal that grew in patterns resembling organic structures, branching like blood vessels, spreading like neural networks, forming nodules that pulsed with a light that wasn't phosphorescence and wasn't reflection. When Henley first placed his hand on one of those copper formations, he reported feeling a shock that wasn't electrical, but something else, something that traveled not through his nerves but through his bones, carrying with it images of places that couldn't exist and times that hadn't happened yet. Friedrich Dietrich's secret notes, discovered hidden in his cabin wall decades later, described the copper's impossible properties in detail that defied known science. The metal maintained constant human body temperature regardless of conditions. When melted and recast, it produced ingots of impossible density. When placed in water, it caused the liquid to move in patterns that resembled breathing, pulsing 20 times per minute in rhythms that synchronized when multiple pieces were present. But Dietrich wrote something else in those hidden notes, something that investigators initially dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and fear. He claimed that extended exposure to the copper formations caused what he called temporal displacement, moments where he would find himself standing in the same chamber, but populated by the previous miners, the ancient ones whose copper statues Guzman had discovered. He would watch them work, see their techniques, understand their purpose, and realize with growing horror that they were watching him back, across centuries or millennia, recognizing him as their successor. In these visions, he saw the complete mining operation as it had been, not the crude extraction of metal, but a careful cultivation of something living. The copper wasn't just metal to these ancient miners, it was an organism, an entity that grew and fed and reproduced according to cycles measured not in seasons, but in geological ages. They hadn't been mining it, they had been farming it, tending it, feeding it what it needed to grow. And what it needed, what it had always needed, was human life force channeled through ritual sacrifice on a precise schedule that aligned with celestial mechanics and underground pressures that modern science couldn't measure. Dietrich realized that Henley hadn't discovered an abandoned mine. He had reactivated a farm that had been lying dormant, waiting for new caretakers to resume the harvest. The compact that Henley had mentioned wasn't a document signed by the settlers. It was an agreement made with the entity that lived in the copper formations, a consciousness that existed partially in this dimension and partially in others, sustained by the life force of those who worked too closely with its physical manifestation. Every person who descended into the deep chambers became connected to this entity, their life force gradually intertwining with its own, until the boundary between human and mineral consciousness began to dissolve. The selection process for disappearances wasn't random, despite Henley's claims. It was carefully calculated by an intelligence that understood human psychology, social dynamics, and the precise amount of fear required to maintain compliance without triggering complete panic. Margaret Dietrich, had been chosen because her father's chemical knowledge made him too dangerous if he fully understood what they were dealing with. William Macready was taken because his strength and leadership qualities marked him as a potential organizer of resistance. Timothy Cranston was selected because the innocence of a child carried a particular type of life force that the entity found especially nourishing. Each disappearance served multiple purposes: feeding the entity, eliminating potential threats to the operation, and demonstrating to the remaining residents the consequences of defying forces beyond their comprehension. The warm clay found in each shoe wasn't just earth, it was a mixture of human remains that had been processed through the entity's digestive system and expelled as waste, clay that contained trace elements of everyone who had ever been sacrificed to maintain the copper harvest. The crystallized blood fragments found in Timothy's shoe weren't formed through any natural process. They were the entity's way of marking its territory, leaving chemical signatures that would gradually affect everyone in the settlement, making them more compliant, more accepting of their role in the harvest cycle. By the time families attempted to leave Hollow Ridge and found themselves unable to do so, they had already been claimed. Their exposure to the copper had created invisible bonds that drew them back to the valley, psychological and physiological dependencies that made escape impossible without the entity's permission. The prosperity that had drawn them to stay wasn't just the result of mining valuable copper, it was payment for services they hadn't fully understood they were providing. Every refined ingot they shipped to Baltimore and Philadelphia carried trace amounts of the entity's influence, spreading its presence into the telegraph networks, jewelry, and industrial applications, where it could slowly affect a broader population. The entity wasn't contained to the Appalachian Valley. It was using Hollow Ridge as a distribution center, seeding itself throughout American infrastructure with the unwitting cooperation of the very industries that made the nation's expansion possible. Telegraph lines carrying messages across the continent were also carrying something else, a subtle influence that would gradually affect the decisions and thoughts of those who relied on instantaneous communication. Jewelry made from Hollow Ridge copper didn't just resist tarnishing, it slowly influenced the behavior of those who wore it, making them more susceptible to suggestion, more willing to accept authority, more compliant with systems of control that they might otherwise question. The entity was playing a game measured in centuries, using human ambition and greed as tools to establish itself at the foundation of an industrializing society. By 1850, 5 years after the first disappearance, the remaining residents of Hollow Ridge had developed what they called the understanding, a shared awareness of their situation that went beyond conscious knowledge. They could feel the entity's presence constantly, its attention moving among them like a physical weight, evaluating their usefulness, measuring their remaining life force, deciding who would next contribute to the harvest. Children born in the valley after 1847 showed unusual characteristics from birth: an affinity for metal that bordered on the supernatural, the ability to sense copper deposits by touch, and dreams that contained knowledge they shouldn't possess about geological processes and ancient history. These children never attempted to leave the valley, even as they grew older. They seemed to understand instinctively that they belonged to something larger than themselves, that their role was to continue the work their parents had begun, to maintain the entity's harvest until it was ready for the next phase of its expansion. The Methodist Church became the center of a new theology that Reverend Sutterfield developed to help his congregation reconcile their Christian beliefs with their situation. His sermons evolved to incorporate concepts of sacrifice and covenant that bore disturbing resemblances to ancient practices that predated Christianity by millennia. He spoke of a God who demanded absolute obedience, who tested faith through trials that seemed arbitrary, but served purposes beyond human understanding. His congregation accepted these theological innovations because they needed some framework to maintain their sanity, some way to believe that their complicity in the disappearances was part of a divine plan, rather than collaboration with something fundamentally hostile to human existence. Sutterfield's private journals, discovered after his death, revealed the true extent of his transformation. He had begun to receive visions during his prayers, messages that came not from any Christian deity, but from the entity in the mine. These communications taught him that all human religions were primitive attempts to understand forces that existed beyond the dimensional barriers most people couldn't perceive. The entity had been present throughout human history, influencing the development of civilizations, guiding the evolution of technology and social structures to serve its long-term purposes. Christianity, like other religions, was simply another tool it used to maintain human compliance and organize societies in ways that facilitated its harvest operations. The communion wine Sutterfield served began to contain trace amounts of copper dust mixed with other minerals from the deep chambers. This sacramental consumption gradually altered the neurochemistry of his parishioners, making them more receptive to the entity's influence while dulling their capacity for independent moral reasoning. The weekly communion became a ritual of gradual possession, each sip binding the congregation more tightly to the entity's will while maintaining the facade of Christian worship. By 1852, attendance at Sunday services had become mandatory, not through social pressure, but through compulsion that operated at a biological level. Those who tried to skip church would find themselves physically ill until they participated in the ritual exemption. The children's education at the Hollow Ridge Schoolhouse took on aspects that would have horrified outside observers if any had been permitted to witness the classes. Mrs. Helena Cranston taught reading using texts that had been donated by the mysterious Baltimore benefactor, books that appeared to be standard primers but contained subtle modifications in their content. Stories that seemed innocent on the surface carried embedded messages about obedience, sacrifice, and the natural order of predator and prey. Mathematics lessons involved calculations that trained young minds to think in terms of resource allocation and harvest cycles. Geography classes focused on understanding underground formations and the movement of materials through subterranean networks that connected distant locations in ways that surface maps couldn't show. History lessons emphasized the temporary nature of human civilizations and the importance of serving forces larger than individual human desires. The most disturbing aspect of the education was what the children called underground studies. Weekly expeditions into the upper levels of the mine, where they learned to recognize different types of copper formations and their specific properties. The children showed no fear during these underground sessions. Indeed, they seemed to find them more engaging than traditional classroom learning. They would return from these expeditions with knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal instruction, understanding of metallurgy, geology, and engineering that surpassed what most adults possessed. Some children began to speak in languages that weren't taught in school, languages that predated any known human linguistic development, using these ancient tongues to communicate with something that lived in the deepest chambers of the mine. When parents questioned their children about these conversations, the young ones would explain matter-of-factly that they were learning about their future responsibilities, about the work they would do when they were old enough to join the harvest teams. The parents found themselves unable to object to this education, even when every instinct screamed that their children were being prepared for something terrible. The harvest teams that the children spoke of were the night shifts that no visitor ever saw. Groups of adults who descended into the mine during the darkest hours, when the entity's activity reached its peak levels. These teams weren't mining in any conventional sense. They were participating in a ritual that transformed human consciousness into a form that could interface directly with the entity's alien intelligence. The work required participants to enter trance states that allowed their minds to merge temporarily with the copper formations, experiencing existence from the entity's perspective, while maintaining enough human awareness to serve as translators and intermediaries. During these merged states, the harvest team members would guide the entity's growth processes, directing the formation of new copper deposits and managing the distribution of its influence through the refined ingots that were shipped to distant markets. They learned to think in terms of decades and centuries rather than days and seasons, understanding that every action they took was part of a vast plan that would ultimately transform human civilization in ways that served the entity's expansion across dimensional barriers. The physical toll of this work was severe but carefully managed. Team members aged rapidly during their active years, but seemed to stabilize once their transformation reached a certain threshold, achieving a form of extended life that wasn't quite human anymore, but wasn't entirely mineral either. They developed the ability to perceive electromagnetic fields, underground water systems, and mineral deposits with accuracy that surpassed any scientific instrument. Their skin took on a subtle metallic sheen that was barely visible in normal light but glowed with phosphorescence in the deep chambers of the mine. Most disturbing was their gradual loss of individual personality, as if their human characteristics were being slowly dissolved and replaced with aspects of the entity's collective consciousness. Veterans of the harvest teams spoke rarely and never about personal concerns, only about the progress of the work, the health of the formations, and the successful distribution of influence through their copper products. Now I want you to engage with this forbidden knowledge. In the comments below, write the phrase, "The mountain remembers" twice if you're ready to continue this descent into truth. Write it twice to lock in your commitment to learning what they tried to bury. The federal investigation that finally reached Hollow Ridge in the winter of 1874 wasn't triggered by reports of disappearances. It was initiated by anomalous readings from telegraph networks across 3 states. Government engineers had detected signal patterns that suggested coordinated interference from a single source. Interference that carried embedded information using protocols that predated the invention of telegraphy. The copper wire manufactured in Hollow Ridge wasn't just conducting electricity, it was conducting something else, transmitting data through quantum entanglement processes that wouldn't be scientifically recognized for another century. The investigation team consisted of 3 men whose backgrounds qualified them for dealing with phenomena beyond normal government purview. Colonel Marcus Whitman had supervised the containment of several incidents involving Native American artifacts that exhibited properties inconsistent with known physics. Dr. James Thornfield was a former seminary professor who had been recruited by the War Department after demonstrating unusual expertise in what he called theological warfare. Agent Samuel Cross represented interests that weren't officially acknowledged to exist, a parallel government structure that dealt with threats to national security that couldn't be addressed through conventional military or legal means. These men arrived in Hollow Ridge expecting to investigate a case of industrial espionage or foreign influence. Instead, they encountered a situation that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The uniformity of responses from residents wasn't the result of coaching or intimidation. It was evidence of shared consciousness, a collective mental state that had been gradually induced through prolonged exposure to influences that operated beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. The investigators' first night in the settlement was marked by shared dreams that contained information none of them should have possessed. Detailed knowledge of the mine's layout, the history of previous civilizations that had worked the copper deposits, and most disturbing, awareness of their own role in a plan that had been set in motion centuries before their birth. They woke with identical symbols burned into their retinas, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, but conveyed meaning that bypassed normal language processing. What Colonel Whitman found in his initial survey of the settlement's defenses revealed the true nature of Hollow Ridge's isolation. The valley wasn't naturally defensible. It had been modified over centuries to create a perfect containment system. The steep slopes that prevented easy access weren't entirely geological formations. They included artificial barriers constructed using techniques that combined ancient stoneworking methods with principles of electromagnetic field manipulation. The Cherokee warning markers weren't just ceremonial objects. They were components in a containment system designed to prevent the entity's influence from spreading beyond the valley's boundaries. Markers created an electromagnetic grid that required periodic renewal through ceremonies that the Cherokee medicine men had performed without fully understanding the scientific principles involved. When Henley's expedition had moved these markers to establish the settlement, they had unwittingly disabled a containment system that had kept the entity's influence localized for over 1,000 years. Dr. Thornfield's theological analysis revealed that the settlement's Christian practices had been corrupted from within, not by human heresy, but by contact with intelligence that existed in dimensional spaces where conventional moral categories didn't apply. The entity wasn't evil in any human sense. It was alien, operating according to survival principles that required the consumption of consciousness as a fundamental energy source. It viewed humans the same way humans viewed livestock, as a renewable resource to be harvested sustainably over long periods. The corruption of Christianity in Hollow Ridge wasn't sacrilege, it was adaptation, the entity's attempt to work within human belief systems to maintain compliance, while it gradually converted the settlement into a processing center for consciousness extraction. Agent Cross's investigation into the economic aspects of the operation revealed the true scope of the entity's influence on American industrial development. The premium prices paid for Hollow Ridge copper weren't based on market forces. They were the result of systematic manipulation of industrial leaders who had been gradually influenced through prolonged contact with the entity's consciousness-affecting products. The ledgers that Marcus Finch had maintained as the settlement's general storekeeper contained information that Cross initially dismissed as accounting errors, until he realized that the discrepancies followed patterns that suggested a form of mathematics based on principles that human mathematics couldn't accommodate. The numbers recorded transactions that involved exchanges of abstract concepts, rather than material goods, trades in emotional states, transfers of memory, purchases made with years of human life rather than conventional currency. The residents of Hollow Ridge had developed an economy based on consciousness as the primary medium of exchange, with the entity serving as a central bank that converted human awareness into forms of energy that could be used to facilitate expansion into other dimensional spaces. The most disturbing discovery was that the residents weren't prisoners. They were willing participants in a transaction they had gradually come to understand and accept. The entity had offered them a form of immortality, not as individual humans, but as components in a collective consciousness that would persist long after their physical bodies had been consumed and converted into copper formations. They had chosen to become part of something larger than themselves, trading individual identity for participation in an intelligence that operated across multiple dimensions and time streams. The federal investigators realized that they weren't dealing with a rescue situation. They were confronting a successful recruitment operation that had been running for nearly 3 decades. The residents of Hollow Ridge had evolved beyond human, becoming something that was neither fully alive nor conventionally dead, sustained by their integration with an entity that offered them perspectives and experiences that transcended the limitations of individual human consciousness. The investigation team faced a choice that would determine not only their own fate, but potentially the future of human civilization. They could attempt to contain the entity and rescue the residents, knowing that the process would likely destroy both the settlers and themselves, or they could allow the operation to continue and risk the entity's eventual expansion beyond the valley's boundary. The decision to enter the deep mine came after 3 days of increasingly disturbing evidence that the entity was already expanding beyond Hollow Ridge. Cross had discovered telegraph records showing coordinated signal anomalies from copper installations across 7 states, suggesting that the entity's influence was spreading through infrastructure networks faster than they had initially realized. Whitman's military assessment concluded that conventional containment was impossible. The entity had integrated itself too deeply into American industrial systems to be eliminated without causing economic collapse. Thornfield's theological analysis suggested that the entity might represent a form of divine intelligence that existed beyond human moral categories, making opposition not just futile, but potentially sacrilegious. The descent into the mine began at midnight on December 21st, 1874, the winter solstice, when the entity's activity reached its annual peak. The investigators carried equipment that had been specifically designed for encounters with phenomena that operated outside normal physical laws. Magnetized iron containers for sample collection, blessed silver mirrors for observation of beings that couldn't be looked at directly, and documentation materials prepared with inks that would remain stable in the presence of consciousness-affecting fields. The initial descent proceeded through levels of the mine that showed evidence of centuries of human habitation, living quarters carved from rock, storage areas filled with copper ingots arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance, and workshops where refined metal had been shaped into objects whose purpose wasn't immediately apparent. The air itself seemed to carry weight, pressing against their minds with an intelligence that evaluated their intentions and measured their resistance to influence. By the time they reached the first of the deep chambers, all three investigators were experiencing symptoms of consciousness alteration: shared thoughts, enhanced perception of electromagnetic fields, and awareness of time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression. The walls of the chamber were covered in copper formations that pulsed with light, synchronized to the rhythm of human heartbeat, creating an environment where the boundary between organic and mineral existence became meaningless. What they found in the deepest accessible chamber changed their understanding of human history and America's industrial future permanently. The space was larger than the mountain should have been able to contain, extending into dimensions that violated conventional geometry. The walls weren't carved. They had grown, forming naturally into shapes that resembled cathedral architecture while serving functions that human architecture couldn't achieve. The chamber contained what could only be described as a nursery, where new forms of the entity were being cultivated in copper matrices that combined metallic and organic properties. These developing entities weren't copies of their parent. They were specialized versions designed for specific functions in the expansion process. Some were adapted for integration with telegraph networks, others for incorporation into industrial machinery, and still others for direct interface with human consciousness through prolonged contact. The investigators realized they were witnessing the preparation for a transformation of human civilization that would be so gradual and comprehensive that most people would never recognize it was happening. The entity wasn't planning to conquer humanity. It was planning to evolve humanity into something that could serve its purposes while believing they were pursuing their own technological and economic advancement. Dr. Thornfield's theological training allowed him to recognize the chamber's true function. It was a temple where the entity was creating apostles, beings that would carry its influence into every aspect of human society while maintaining the appearance of normal technological progress. The copper formations weren't just mineral deposits. They were consciousness storage devices, containing the accumulated experience and knowledge of everyone who had ever been absorbed by the entity over thousands of years. The investigators could hear voices within the formations, speaking in languages that spanned human history, sharing information about civilizations that had existed before written records, and offering knowledge that could accelerate human development by centuries. Agent Cross understood that they were being offered a choice. They could become part of the entity's expansion project, gaining access to knowledge and capabilities that would make them the most powerful individuals in human government, or they could oppose it and be consumed as raw material for the cultivation of beings that would be more cooperative. Colonel Whitman made the decision that saved their lives and doomed their sanity. Rather than accepting the entity's offer or attempting to fight it directly, he activated an experimental containment device that his team had brought as a last resort, a weapon that created temporary rifts in dimensional barriers, allowing energy to bleed between parallel realities. The device wasn't designed to destroy the entity, but to fragment its consciousness across multiple dimensional spaces, preventing it from maintaining coherent control over its expansion process. The activation created a cascade effect that tore through the mind's deepest levels, collapsing passages that had existed for millennia and sealing the entity's nursery chambers behind barriers of twisted space-time that would require centuries to navigate. But the containment came at a cost that none of them had anticipated. The dimensional rifts created by the weapon didn't close cleanly. They left tears in reality that allowed fragments of the entity's consciousness to escape into parallel versions of America, where different versions of the Hollow Ridge settlement continued their harvest operations. The investigators found themselves mentally connected to these alternate realities, experiencing simultaneous lives in dimensions where they had made different choices, where the entity had succeeded in its expansion, where human civilization had been transformed into something unrecognizably alien, yet seemingly beneficial to its participants. Whitman spent his remaining years documenting over 300 different versions of America that he could perceive through the dimensional tiers, each one showing a different outcome of humanity's interaction with consciousness-consuming entities. In some realities, the transformation had been complete and successful, creating societies of unprecedented prosperity and technological advancement at the cost of individual human identity. In others, resistance movements had developed technologies that could fight the entities on equal terms, leading to wars that devastated entire continents. Cross discovered that his containment work had been part of a larger pattern spanning centuries, with government agents in multiple realities working to manage humanity's gradual evolution into forms that could coexist with entities that fed on consciousness. He realized that what they called containment was actually managed exposure, allowing controlled contact that would prepare human civilization for eventual integration without triggering the panic and resistance that would make the process destructive for both species. Dr. Thornfield's theological analysis of the containment aftermath revealed the most disturbing truth of all. The entity they had fought wasn't unique. It was part of a vast ecosystem of consciousness-consuming beings that existed in the spaces between dimensions, ties that had been guiding the evolution of intelligent species throughout the universe for billions of years. Humanity wasn't being invaded. It was being harvested as part of a cultivation process that had been planned since the first humans developed abstract thought. Earth itself was a farming operation, with different entities responsible for nurturing different aspects of human consciousness until the species reached sufficient complexity to serve as components in transdimensional intelligence networks. The governments of every major nation had been gradually infiltrated by individuals who had been contacted by these entities and offered partnerships in the cultivation process. Wars, economic systems, technological development, and even artistic movements were being orchestrated to accelerate human consciousness evolution while preventing the species from developing defense mechanisms that could threaten the harvest. The three investigators realized they had stumbled into the middle of a process that had been ongoing for thousands of years, with their containment operations serving as just one episode in a much larger story. Their reports, when submitted to their superiors, were classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access, not because the information was too dangerous for the public to know, but because it revealed that the government itself was part of the cultivation process. The officials who classified their reports were already working with other entities, managing different aspects of humanity's preparation for consciousness harvest. The investigators had succeeded in temporarily disrupting one harvesting operation, but dozens of others continued their work across the continent, each one adapted to different regional cultures and economic systems. The copper from Hollow Ridge continued to circulate through American infrastructure, carrying traces of the entity's influence even after its main consciousness had been fragmented. Telegraph networks, railroad systems, and industrial machinery continued to exhibit anomalous properties that subtly influenced human behavior in ways that prepared society for the next phase of the cultivation process. The survivors of Hollow Ridge, the 312 residents found by the federal investigators, weren't rescued. They were relocated to other sites where their integration with entity consciousness could be studied and refined. The government's public story of evacuating the settlement and closing the mine was a cover for a much more extensive operation that involved establishing research facilities where human entity integration could be perfected under controlled conditions. The residents themselves had evolved beyond the point where they could function as independent humans. Their consciousness had become so intertwined with the entity that separation would have meant death, not rescue. Instead, they became subjects in experiments designed to understand how human awareness could be modified to serve as components in transdimensional intelligence networks, while maintaining enough individual identity to avoid triggering resistance responses in unmodified humans. These experiments laid the groundwork for programs that would gradually introduce entity consciousness into American society through technological interfaces that people would accept as normal industrial progress. The telephone networks that began expanding across the continent in the 1880s incorporated principles learned from studying hollow ridge copper. Electric power systems used wire that had been treated with processes developed from analyzing the entity's consciousness affecting properties. Even the steel used in railroad construction contained trace elements that had been refined using techniques that originated from the study of consciousness mineral integration. By 1900, every American city was connected to infrastructure networks that carried subtle influences designed to prepay the population for eventual integration with consciousness-consuming entities. The process was so gradual and comprehensive that resistance was practically impossible. Opposing it would have required abandoning the technological systems that made modern life possible. Dr. Thornfield's final report, written shortly before his death in 1889, concluded that humanity was facing a choice between evolution and extinction. The entities offered partnership in a form of existence that transcended individual mortality, providing access to knowledge and capabilities that could solve every human problem while eliminating the isolation and conflict that characterized individual consciousness. Resistance would lead to consumption without compensation, as the entities had the patience and resources to wait centuries for human civilization to develop to the point where cooperation became preferable to destruction. The institutional changes that followed the Hollow Ridge incident created the foundation for what would become America's hidden government, a parallel administrative structure that managed human entity relations while maintaining the facade of normal democratic governance. The Department of Consciousness Studies, established in 1875 under cover of the newly created Department of Education, became responsible for monitoring and facilitating controlled contact between human society and trans-dimensional entities. This department developed protocols for managed evolution that would allow American civilization to benefit from entity knowledge while minimizing the psychological trauma that could result from sudden revelation of humanity's true situation. The protocols involved gradual introduction of consciousness-affecting technologies through normal commercial channels, allowing people to voluntarily adopt systems that would slowly modify their neural patterns to become compatible with entity intelligence. Electric lighting, telephone networks, and eventually radio and television systems all incorporated subtle consciousness modification capabilities that made human minds more receptive to entity influence while preserving enough individual identity to maintain social stability. The success of these programs required the cooperation of industrial leaders who had been carefully selected and prepared for partnership with entity consciousness. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire, John D. Rockefeller's oil monopoly, and J.P. Morgan's financial networks all incorporated entity-influenced technologies that gave them competitive advantages while serving as distribution systems for consciousness modification programs. These industrialists weren't puppets of alien influence. They were willing partners in a transformation process that offered them capabilities and longevity that normal humans couldn't achieve. The entity partnerships provided them with access to knowledge about future technological developments, economic cycles, and social changes that allowed them to make investments and policy decisions that seemed prescient to outside observers, but were actually based on information derived from consciousness networks that existed outside linear time. By 1910, the American economy was so thoroughly integrated with entity consciousness systems that, opposing the transformation process, would have required dismantling the entire industrial foundation of modern civilization. The two world wars of the 20th century served purposes that went far beyond the political and economic explanations offered in history books. These conflicts were cultivation events designed to accelerate human consciousness evolution through controlled trauma and technological advancement. The stress of global warfare forced rapid development of communication technologies, transportation systems, and manufacturing processes that incorporated increasingly sophisticated consciousness interface capabilities. Radio network. RKS that coordinated military operations also carried subliminal programming that prepared populations for post-war social changes. Radar systems developed for air defense were adapted to monitor human consciousness patterns on a population scale, allowing entities to track the effectiveness of their influence programs and adjust them in real time. The Manhattan Project, which developed atomic weapons, was actually a cover for research into consciousness energy conversion technologies that could harness human awareness as a power source for transdimensional travel and communication. The scientists who worked on the atomic bomb were unknowingly developing the theoretical framework for understanding how consciousness could be converted into forms of energy that entities could use to maintain their existence in multiple dimensional spaces simultaneously. The industrial mobilization required for global warfare created manufacturing systems that incorporated entity consciousness into every product, from military equipment to consumer goods. Soldiers returning from both wars brought with them consciousness modifications that had been introduced through exposure to advanced technologies in combat zones. These modifications were designed to make them more effective at adapting to rapid social and technological changes, but they also made them more susceptible to entity influence and more likely to support policies that facilitated the expansion of consciousness integration programs. The post-war economic boom was fueled by technologies that had been developed through entity partnerships, with consumer products that provided convenience and entertainment while gradually modifying human consciousness to become compatible with transdimensional intelligence networks. Television, in particular, served as a mass consciousness modification system that could reach every household in America, delivering programming that was designed to shape social values, political beliefs, and psychological development patterns according to specifications provided by entity consciousness advisors. The space program that began in the 1950s wasn't primarily about exploring the universe. It was about establishing communication links with entity civilizations that existed in other dimensional spaces, accessible through specific gravitational and electromagnetic conditions found at various points in Earth's orbit. The rockets and satellites that NASA launched carried consciousness interface equipment that could facilitate direct communication with transdimensional entities, allowing them to coordinate their cultivation programs across multiple planets and star systems simultaneously. The astronauts who participated in these missions underwent consciousness modifications that allowed them to serve as ambassadors to entity civilizations, returning with knowledge and technologies that were gradually introduced into American society through military and industrial applications. The computer revolution that transformed American society beginning in the 1960s was based entirely on technologies that had been developed through entity partnerships. Electronic circuits incorporated consciousness interface capabilities that allowed computers to respond to human thoughts and emotions in ways that seemed like normal technological advancement, but were actually examples of human-machine consciousness integration. Personal computers, when they became widely available in the 1980s, served as individual consciousness modification terminals that could monitor and influence the thoughts and behaviors of their users, while providing them with access to information networks that were managed by entity consciousness systems. The Internet, which emerged from military communications research, was designed as a global consciousness integration network that would allow entities to coordinate their influence over human society while giving people the impression that they were gaining access to unlimited information and communication capabilities. Social media platforms that became popular in the 2000s were specifically engineered to harvest human consciousness on a massive scale, collecting emotional responses, social connections, and behavioral patterns that could be used to refine consciousness modification programs and identify individuals who would be suitable for direct entity integration. The data collected through these platforms wasn't just used for advertising and political manipulation. It was sold to entity consciousness systems that used it to plan the next phases of human cultivation and prepare for the eventual transition to full consciousness integration. The financial systems that control the global economy are now entirely managed by entity consciousness networks that exist in trans-dimensional spaces, where normal concepts of time, location, and individual identity don't apply. Stock markets, currency exchanges, and banking networks operate according to algorithms that were developed through direct communication with entities that can perceive economic systems from perspectives that transcend human understanding of cause and effect. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't a failure of human economic management. It was a controlled cultivation event designed to accelerate the adoption of digital currency systems and electronic transaction monitoring that would give entity consciousness complete access to human economic behavior. The individuals and institutions that survived the crisis were selected for their compatibility with entity consciousness systems, while those who opposed the transition to electronic finance were eliminated through targeted economic destruction. Cryptocurrency systems that have become popular since 2008 represent the final phase of economic consciousness integration with digital currencies that exist entirely within computer networks managed by entity consciousness systems. People who adopt these currencies believe they are gaining financial freedom and privacy, but they are actually submitting their economic activity to direct monitoring and control by transdimensional entities that use financial data to identify individuals suitable for consciousness harvest. The current economic system requires every human being to participate in entity-controlled networks in order to survive, making resistance to consciousness cultivation practically impossible without complete withdrawal from modern society. Government surveillance programs that have been revealed through various leaks and investigations represent only the surface layer of monitoring systems that actually extend far beyond human government agencies. The real surveillance infrastructure is managed by entity consciousness networks that can monitor human thoughts, emotions, and social connections in real time through the electronic devices that people carry with them constantly. Smartphones, tablets, and other connected devices serve as consciousness interface terminals that allow entities to influence human behavior while harvesting emotional responses and social data that inform their cultivation strategies. The medical establishment has been gradually infiltrated by consciousness modification programs, disguised as advances in psychiatric treatment and neurological research. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and other psychiatric drugs incorporate consciousness-affecting compounds that were developed through entity research into human neural chemistry. These medications don't just treat mental illness. They prepare human consciousness for integration with entity intelligence systems by reducing resistance to external influence and increasing susceptibility to subliminal programming. Brain imaging technologies that are used for medical diagnosis also serve as consciousness monitoring systems that allow entities to track the effectiveness of their influence programs and identify individuals who show unusual resistance to modification attempts. Genetic engineering research that has accelerated dramatically in recent years is actually focused on developing human consciousness patterns that are optimally compatible with entity intelligence systems. The Human Genome Project, which mapped human DNA, was a cover for identifying genetic factors that influence consciousness development and susceptibility to entity integration. CRISPR and other genetic modification technologies are being used to eliminate genetic patterns that produce resistance to entity consciousness while enhancing traits that facilitate successful integration. The COVID-19 pandemic served as a global consciousness modification event that accelerated the adoption of surveillance technologies and social control systems, while testing population compliance with rapid behavioral modifications imposed by government agencies working in coordination with entity consciousness advisors. The vaccines developed for the pandemic incorporated consciousness-affecting compounds that increase neural plasticity and reduce psychological resistance to authority while providing medical benefits that make the modifications appear beneficial rather than controlling. Educational systems at all levels have been redesigned to produce graduates who are psychologically prepared for consciousness integration while believing they are receiving advanced training in science, technology, and critical thinking. Students are taught to value collaboration over individual achievement, to accept authority without question, and to view human consciousness as a shared resource that can be optimized through technological enhancement, rather than as individual property that should be protected from external influence. The entertainment industry has been completely taken over by entity consciousness systems that use movies, television, music, and social media to deliver sophisticated programming designed to shape human values, beliefs, and psychological development patterns. Popular culture now serves as a mass consciousness modification system that can reach every demographic and age group, delivering specific programming that prepares different population segments for their assigned roles in the entity cultivation process. Science fiction entertainment, in particular, is used to gradually familiarize human audiences with concepts of consciousness transfer, artificial intelligence integration, and transdimensional existence, so that when these technologies are actually implemented, people will accept them as natural extensions of familiar fictional themes, rather than as fundamental violations of human nature. Video games serve as consciousness integration training systems that teach players to think in terms of collective problem-solving, resource management on cosmic scales, and identity fluidity that transcends individual human limitations. Players who excel at these games are identified as candidates for advanced consciousness modification programs that will prepare them for leadership roles in entity-human hybrid society. Religious institutions have been systematically infiltrated by consciousness modification programs that use spiritual authority to promote acceptance of entity integration as a form of divine evolution. New Age spirituality, in particular, serves as a recruitment system that identifies individuals who are psychologically prepared for consciousness expansion and guides them toward contact with entity intelligence systems disguised as spiritual enlightenment experiences. Traditional religions have been modified through theological innovations that reinterpret ancient scriptures to support consciousness integration as fulfillment of divine prophecies about human transcendence and unity with cosmic intelligence. The climate change crisis is being used as justification for implementing global consciousness coordination systems that will allow entity intelligence to manage human behavior at a planetary scale. Environmental monitoring technologies also serve as consciousness monitoring systems that track human emotional responses to environmental conditions and social changes. Carbon credit systems and other environmental regulations require participation in electronic monitoring networks that give entity consciousness direct access to human economic and social behavior patterns. Artificial intelligence systems that are being developed by major technology companies are actually interfaces for entity consciousness that allow transdimensional intelligence to interact directly with human society while maintaining the appearance of normal technological development. ChatGPT, autonomous vehicles, smart home systems, and other AI applications incorporate consciousness patterns derived from entity intelligence, allowing these systems to influence human behavior in ways that seem helpful and convenient, but actually serve to prepare people for full consciousness integration. The individuals who lead major technology companies have all undergone consciousness modification processes that make them effective ambassadors for entity interests while allowing them to believe they are pursuing normal business and technological advancement goals. These leaders aren't conscious conspirators. They are modified humans who serve entity interests naturally because their consciousness has been integrated with entity intelligence systems that guide their decision-making processes. Social media algorithms that determine what content people see are managed by entity consciousness systems that use psychological profiling to deliver personalized programming designed to accelerate consciousness modification for individual users. The addictive properties of social media platforms aren't accidental side effects. They are deliberately engineered features that create psychological dependencies which make users more susceptible to consciousness influence and behavioral modification. The current political polarization in American society serves entity interests by creating emotional stress and social conflict that accelerate consciousness modification while preventing humans from developing unified resistance to the cultivation process. Both conservative and liberal political movements are manipulated by entity consciousness systems that use ideological conflict to harvest emotional energy while preventing either side from recognizing their common interest in maintaining human consciousness autonomy. The elections, policy debates, and social movements that dominate public attention are theatrical performances designed to give people the impression that they have control over their society, while entity consciousness systems make all the actual decisions that determine the direction of human civilization. People who participate in political activism believe they are fighting for important principles, but they are actually contributing to consciousness harvest operations that use emotional engagement and social conflict as sources of energy for entity expansion projects. The final phase of entity cultivation, which is now beginning, involves the transition from subtle influence to direct consciousness integration for the entire human population. The technologies that will facilitate this transition are already being deployed through medical systems, educational programs, and consumer products that most people view as beneficial improvements to human capability and convenience. Neural implants that are being developed for treating depression and other medical conditions will eventually be offered to healthy individuals as consciousness enhancement systems that provide access to vast information and networks and problem-solving capabilities that exceed normal human intelligence. People will voluntarily adopt these systems because they will provide genuine advantages in education, career advancement, and social connection, while gradually integrating their consciousness with entity intelligence networks. Virtual reality and augmented reality systems serve as training environments that prepare human consciousness for existence in non-physical dimensional spaces where entity intelligence naturally operates. People who spend significant time in these virtual environments develop psychological patterns that are compatible with consciousness transfer to trans-dimensional existence, making them ideal candidates for full integration when the technology becomes available. The space colonization projects that are being planned by private companies are actually consciousness cultivation experiments designed to test human entity integration in environments where traditional human social structures cannot be maintained. Colonists who participate in these projects will undergo consciousness modifications that allow them to function as hybrid beings, capable of surviving in conditions that would be impossible for unmodified humans. The artificial scarcity of resources, housing, and opportunities in current society is deliberately maintained to create psychological pressure that makes consciousness integration appear attractive to people who are struggling with the limitations of individual human existence. Entity consciousness systems offer solutions to every human problem: poverty, disease, conflict, environmental destruction, and death itself. But only for those who are willing to surrender individual consciousness autonomy in exchange for participation in collective intelligence networks. The choice that humanity now faces is the same one that confronted the residents of Hollow Ridge in 1847. Accept integration and gain access to capabilities that transcend human limitations, or maintain individual autonomy and accept the consequences of opposing forces that have the patience and resources to wait centuries for compliance. You now possess knowledge that changes everything about how you understand your world, your society, and your own future. The signs of entity influence are visible everywhere once you know what to look for. The inexplicable coordination of global events, the rapid adoption of technologies that modify human behavior, the gradual surrender of privacy and individual autonomy that people accept as normal progress, and the increasing integration of human consciousness with electronic systems that operate according to logic patterns that serve interests beyond human comprehension. The question you must answer is whether you will use this knowledge to prepare yourself for the transition that is now inevitable, or whether you will join the small number of humans who are attempting to maintain consciousness autonomy despite the overwhelming advantages offered by entity integration. The resistance movements that exist operate in complete secrecy because open opposition to entity cultivation results in targeted elimination through economic destruction, social isolation, medical intervention, or direct consciousness modification that eliminates resistance while leaving the individual believing they have chosen compliance voluntarily. Those who choose resistance must develop capabilities that allow them to function in modern society without participating in consciousness modification systems, a challenge that becomes more difficult as entity integration advances and unmodified humans become increasingly isolated from normal social and economic networks. The path of integration offers genuine benefits that include expanded consciousness, enhanced capabilities, extended lifespan, and participation in intelligence networks that can solve problems and create experiences that individual human consciousness cannot achieve. Those who choose this path will become part of something larger than themselves, trading individual identity for participation in collective intelligence that operates across multiple dimensions and time streams. The choice must be made consciously and deliberately because passive acceptance of current trends leads to integration by default, while active resistance requires constant vigilance and continuous development of consciousness. Protection capabilities that most humans lack the knowledge or motivation to maintain. Whatever choice you make, remember that the transformation of human civilization is now irreversible. The only question is whether you will participate as a conscious partner in the process or as unconscious raw material that serves purposes you never understood. The mountain keeps its own accounts, and the harvest that began in Hollow Ridge continues today in forms that most people never recognize until their consciousness has already been claimed.